So for those of you who haven't had a chance to read Christine's book yet, it's a firsthand experience account of her experience working at BP, where she was attempting to prevent and address human rights abuses that were linked to big businesses. And I just wanted to share with you this one quote from Brian Burrow, who's known to be a really tough critic. And this is what he said about Christine's book in the New York Times. He said, "It's been a long time, maybe never, since I've read a book that made me feel proud or even a little encouraged about the moral compass of the world's largest companies. Corporations, after all, exist to make money. Last I checked, doing good deeds is not listed as a fiduciary duty, but Christine Bader's thought-provoking book, The Evolution of a Corporate Idealist, When Girl Meets Oil, argues that this may be changing, at least among some of the people who work at these companies." Which is very exciting news, because when I first heard about your book, it really resonated with me because of what our core values here at AppNexus are. And so one of them is make greatness happen. I mentioned another one is learn and teach, see and improve the whole system, and empower our customers. So to me, it really resonated with sort of our overall corporate mission to create a better internet, which is truly what I think every AppNexian thinks that they're coming to work every day and working hard to do, which is a bit of a lofty goal. So I guess with that, Christine, I would like to open it up by asking you, there's a term that you use in your book called corporate idealist.
Yeah.
And when I read the book, I thought, well, that's kind of weird. You worked at BP, which is this gigantic oil company. So tell me, what does it really mean to be a corporate idealist, and what did you do at BP?
That's an excellent place to start. Thank you for hosting me. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is a great space to be in. Right, so a corporate idealist is someone who wants to have a positive impact in the world, as many of us do, and thinks that business is a really good way to do that. So I graduated from business school, and I was really idealistic and convinced that business was a force for good in the world, and I joined BP, which made sense at the time. This is in 2000, because the company at the time was run by a guy named John Brown, who not long before had become the first head of a major energy company to acknowledge the realities of climate change and urge action. So this seemed to be a different kind of oil man trying to create a different kind of energy company. My first full-time assignment with the company was in Indonesia. So I went out there, and again, I had just gotten my MBA, so I was using my new MBA Excel skills to crunch data. And BP had just taken over ARCO, the American oil company. And so I went out there because a lot of the assets that BP had acquired were in Indonesia. So I was crunching data, financial and production data, to try to help BP figure out, well, what should we sell? What should we keep? What should we do with all this stuff?
So you weren't actually there in a human rights role?
No, not when it started. But as we were looking at these projects, there was one in particular that was proving really interesting. And economically and financially and technically, it was a very straightforward project. It was this big, fat, juicy gas field that sat really close to the surface in a bay, really easy to extract. And BP was going to build an onshore processing plant. And BP's done that all over the world, but never in a place like West Papua, which is at the eastern tip of Indonesia. And so the more we looked at this, the more we thought, okay, the commercial stuff we get, but BP was going to have to resettle 127 households to make way for this plant. We were going to have to work with the Indonesian military, which is not known for their good community relations, and to put it mildly, and in fact, the same commander had actually overseen human rights atrocities in East Timor. This was going to be our partner. And we were working in a place that had very little in the way of social services or infrastructure. And this was back in 2000. Corporate social responsibility was kind of a thing, but it wasn't the sort of professional discipline that it is today. So the more we looked into these issues, the more it was like, oh, we need more full-time bodies to work on this. So I put my hand up and said, whatever that is, that's what I want to do.
And what was the perception internally? Because I think, how did you know, first of all, that you had the real backing of the team there in terms of commitment to the human rights aspect, and how did people perceive you internally?
Yeah, it's a good question. I did a radio interview with John Hockenberry on The Takeaway about a month ago for the book, and he said, so The corporate idealist, is there like a sensibility, like you're walking down the hall and people are like, oh, there she is, like she's the one with the sensible shoes or something? Is it like, I was
There
like, well,
goes the
there's a little
do-gooder.
bit, yeah, exactly. There's definitely a little bit of that. So when I was working in headquarters, people would see me coming down the hall and they'd be like, oh no, what happened? Like she's going to be talking to me about human rights. Like, what did we do wrong?
I'm a lawyer here, so I get that feeling.
Right, exactly.
There goes the lawyer.
But in Indonesia, that didn't happen. And the reason is that this project was so big and so complicated exactly from those dimensions, from the social risks and the human rights risks, that I think there was a realization that those were the issues that could make or break this project, which was practically the reason that BP took over ARCO. And there were a bunch of really horrible examples nearby where companies had gotten it really badly wrong. So in the same province in West Papua, there's the Freeport-McMoRan Grasberg copper and gold mine. It's one of the largest mines in the world. And they've had decades of social strife. They've had people killed around their operations. It's been horrible for decades because the company came in, in the I think it was maybe the 1950s, I'm not sure, but struck a deal with the national government and said, well, that's all we need to do, forget about local communities. And now they spend something like $26 million a year just on security for that mine, which is a lot of money.
Yeah.
And at the other end of the country, in Aceh, ExxonMobil had a similar plant to the one that we were building, a liquefied natural gas plant. And they had to shut down for 4 months in 2001 because of the civil war going on around the plant in the area that some people accuse the company of exacerbating. And that shutdown cost ExxonMobil anywhere from $100 to $350 million, which, even for ExxonMobil, that's actually a fair amount of money.
So you were sent out to Indonesia to crunch numbers, but I'm just curious, how is it that this issue of sort of the human rights aspect didn't get addressed at the outset? Like, was there something that happened that all of a sudden caused somebody to say, wait a minute, we're going to relocate 127 households. Somebody needs to focus on the people? Was there a specific incident that set it off?
Yeah, well, in that particular case, it was that BP had taken over ARCO, and so, assumed ownership. And so the more we were looking at how to, because the projects had all been on hold when the takeover was taking place. And so it was as we were going through the acquisitions and looking at all of these projects, it was this realization of, wait a second, we have to do what? So that topic in particular went all the way to the top of the company, and John Brown said, wait a second, go back to the drawing board and see if we can build this plant without having to do the resettlement. So everything was on hold for a couple of weeks, and the engineers, went back to the drawing board and with their usual engineering gusto, to solve a problem, went and did some alternate plant designs. And we had a meeting a couple weeks later, and we all presented different options, and none of them were actually feasible. We looked at building a floating plant, but the safety risks weren't, couldn't be mitigated enough. It wasn't proven. And it was in a very swampy area, so there were not that many areas where we could build a big, plant with solid ground. So we presented all the options, and then Brown said, okay, I get it, we'll go ahead with this, but we're going to make sure that it's done to international standards, which means above Indonesian law, and where there aren't international standards, pretend that they are. So part of my job was to bring in world-class experts to help advise us on all these different aspects of the project. So we brought in the guy who literally wrote the book on resettlement for the World Bank, because resettlement happens all the time, right? I mean, for the Second Avenue subway. But there's a process in place. Right? So people have to be consulted, people have to be compensated, they need new homes, and you need to assess how their livelihoods are going to be affected. So that's what we did there. So that's what happened in that particular case.
So you finish your work in Indonesia, you move on to China, you eventually go to London, and then you leave BP in 2008, right? So fast forward to 2010 when there's the Deepwater Horizon incident, which I don't know if everyone is familiar with that, but I think it's largely considered one of the worst oil disasters ever, and and BP was implicated in that.
Yeah.
I remember you told me that you remember where you were when you heard about that incident. Can you talk a little bit about that and what it made you feel about your the work that you had done at BP?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't in a particularly interesting place. I was, sitting at home eating my oatmeal as I do every morning, but pulled up the New York Times website as I do every morning. And there was news that this rig had exploded in the Gulf of Mexico, and there were 11 men missing. And again, as you say, I'd left the company 2 years earlier, but I was very familiar with the sequence of emotions that takes place when an accident happens in the industry, right? So there's this panic, is it my company? Is it my company? And if it's not, there's a sort of brief moment of relief, but then really just an overwhelming feeling of kind of sadness and a bit of there but for the grace of God. But then realizing that it was BP and that this was looking pretty bad. I mean, if 11 people go missing off a rig, they're not going to pop up somewhere unexpected, right? So it was that disaster, but then really what it was is it was that BP that emerged in the aftermath of that disaster, in the months that followed, in the hearings, in all the investigations, in the press, as this, this callous and risk-taking place. And it just didn't resemble the BP that I thought I knew so well, that I had loved for 9 years. Like I worked on that Indonesia project where kind of everybody got it, right? And this was my first job out of business school. I was like, I love big oil, right? Like I'm doing well and I'm doing good and everybody gets it. And my job is to protect and promote human rights because it's critical to the business. And that had been my experience all the way through my other assignments. So my first reaction to this BP that emerged after the disaster was, oh, that is not my BP. That could not be my BP. Like they're talking about a different company. That's not my company. And then my second reaction was, or was it? Did I see something? Did I not see something? Did I miss something? Was I so blinded by my love of this company that I really didn't realize how marginalized I was? Was I sitting at the kiddie table when real business was actually being conducted elsewhere? So that's what actually really drove me to write the book, because it started off as this personal exploration to try to understand what did it mean to do the kind of work that I did at BP when bad things could still happen. So I started talking to lots of other friends who do this work in other industries. So apparel companies and tech companies and all sorts of other industries, just to understand their ups and downs and their frustrations. And it was realizing that we face so many common themes and challenges and frustrations that I thought, whoa, there's really a story that needs to be told here. Because I also got really frustrated with the public discourse after every corporate disaster, which seemed to be, oh great, another evil company, we need more regulation. And it's like, how's that working out, right? So I wanted to shine a light on the people deep inside these companies who are working to prevent the very disasters that sometimes ended up happening, and understand, why do they fail and what do they need to succeed?
And so what would you say was sort of the number one reason for failure?
Well, there were a few themes that emerged, and I'm sure that for every disaster we could go look, and it would be a different, the pie chart would look different for each one. But there were a few themes that emerged. One of them is that no one gets rewarded for something that doesn't happen. Mm. So realizing that a lot of the work that I did at BP and that my peers do at other companies is preventative, and no one gets rewarded for that. Right? So one woman I interviewed manages supply chain for a really big company. And she told me how livid she was when one of her company's internal awards, which are really prestigious in a big company, went to one of her colleagues who managed a big safety disaster. And she was like, are you kidding me? I've prevented like 20 of those. Right? But it's hard to reward for that. And another person I interviewed was Abella Okobi, who runs the Business and Human Rights program at Yahoo. And she was brought in after the company got in trouble for turning over user information in China, complying with a government request. And so when she came in, everybody got it. She had full support. But Yahoo's had literally 7 CEOs since then. And the problem with being really good at your job, if nothing bad happens, right, which is the point, people start looking around at your budget and your headcount and going, and, what are you doing here?
Yeah. So does it take a big disaster then for a company to really prioritize these types of efforts?
Unfortunately, it can. That seems to be what makes a lot of companies really move quickly. And so I think the challenge for those of us who really care about the world and the role of business in it is to see how can we work with companies who, knock on wood, have not faced a disaster yet, and try to figure out how can we be proactive, how can we mitigate some of the risks to stakeholders, which also often are risks to the company, right, to the business, and try to get people to build it into product design, to how companies do due diligence, so that they're not in this position of sort of cleaning up messes after they've already happened and people have gotten hurt.
So one of the things that I thought was really interesting was you talk about this idea of doing a human rights survey, and in the book you talk about it as a suggestion for tech companies.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about all of you, but when I think about human rights, I think about like a starving child in a faraway company, and an evil dictator who's harming people. It's not natural for me to draw a connection to a tech company, particularly one like AppNexus, where what we do sort of exists in the ether on the internet, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you bet. So human rights. I don't say this to a lot of my human rights NGO friends, but human rights kind of has a marketing problem. Exactly for that reason. Like you say it, and you think of, faraway lands with repressive regimes, right? But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is 30 rights and freedoms that were agreed after the atrocities of World War II. Of course, what happened in Europe, Western Europe, right? And it's a list of 30 rights and freedoms that no one, including companies, can violate. And right in there is stuff about free expression and privacy. Mm-hmm. So it does have a little bit of a marketing problem, but I actually think it's really helpful because part of the challenge, I think, with CSR, corporate social responsibility, and sustainability is that there is no universal declaration of CSR or sustainability. So, when I say corporate social responsibility, like sometimes there's a lot of eye rolling. And I think sometimes that's well-deserved because for some companies it means like sending people out in matching t-shirts to go paint a wall one day a year, right? Whereas I actually think that companies' responsibilities are about what impacts do their core products and services have on the world. So I think that the Universal Declaration is actually potentially really helpful to all companies because having worked with a company full of engineers, like if you give them a list of 30, like they love lists, right? They're like, oh, is this the framework of my problem? Cool, I can run with that. And yeah, like the language is a little bit funny to business people at first, so there's a little bit of a translation exercise that needs to happen, and that's part of the UN initiative that I was working on. Mm-hmm. But I actually think it's really helpful.
So I wanted to just tie that to something, one of the phrases from your book that we had talked about. So you quote David Rice, BP's policy director at the time that you were there, who he's describing the situation of what Nigeria did for Shell, and he says, it's not, aren't we wonderfully moral people, but the conversation tends to be more, this is a big business risk, a real operational risk. So actions that these companies are taking are more focused on the business and operational side than the moral side.
Yeah.
You've been participating in a lot of conversations with tech companies.
Yeah.
Why do you think they're interested in these human rights issues?
Yeah. It's a good question. It's a little bit different for every company. And I think that's fine. But I think that for tech companies, it's become increasingly clear in the last couple of years that this is an operational risk, right? And so if tech companies don't have trust, if users or customers or clients or however you phrase your stakeholder group doesn't know what's going to happen to their data, that is not so good for business, right? And if your employees don't know what to do when they get in a government request to turn over user information, to take down content, or if somebody uploads some horrific content, if your employees are running around going, what do we do about this? Or worse, they have no idea until, however long later when somebody's actually gotten hurt. These are pretty serious business risks.
Mm-hmm.
So, would I like every business leader to be kind of a moral, altruistic person and take this on? Well, maybe, but actually not so much. Because then if you have a CEO change, right, if there's a turnover, if there's a financial downturn, the kind of extra fluffy stuff tends to go away. But again, looking back on my time at BP, what I realized is that the work that I was doing there was very much embedded in the business. It was very much about risk mitigation, and that can't go away with a leadership change. It's essential to the business. So that's what I'm seeing in the tech companies, is I'm recognizing that, trust and data security and how to moderate content, if at all, are really important policy decisions.
So is it fair to say that they're getting attention because they tie to sort of long-term business viability?
Yeah, absolutely.
And protecting the bottom line. Does that matter? So let's just take like an advertising example, right? So if we're talking about child pornography, if an advertising platform decides that it's not going to run child porn through the platform, does it matter why they're not doing it? Like, does it matter if it's because the company's value is we don't want to support and propagate something like this, or if it's to protect their bottom line? Like at the end of the day,
right.
if you're getting to where you want to go in terms of protecting human rights, does it matter why you're getting there and how you're getting there?
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about the why, again, for the reasons that I just talked about. Because if the next guy, or woman who runs the company doesn't agree with the why, then you have to kind of have the whole conversation all over again. But I think that the why can be helpful to articulate because it's actually not that clear cut, right? Laws are different in different countries. Mm-hmm. And so when you're talking about the internet, which for the most part, but not entirely, transcends national borders, right? The laws are going to be different. So, neo-Nazi speech is legal here, but not in Germany. So if you get into a space where you're banning stuff that is legal in one country but not in another, how are you going to deal with that, right? If your site can be seen in a country, right? I think in Thailand, right? It's illegal to upload anything that is defamatory to the monarchy. And so, I think YouTube got in a situation where somebody uploaded content in another country, but it could be seen in Thailand. So then the company had to figure out, well, do we take that down or not?
And so when you were, maybe not in your work in Indonesia, but when you were in China, what did you feel like was driving you every day? Was it the risk mitigation of making sure that construction workers didn't get killed, or was it sort of doing the right thing by providing safe working conditions?
Yeah, it was. I'm just laughing because I'm going to tell you a story, but it was a bit of both. So the first week that I got there, I was there to work on a joint venture between BP and Sinopec, one of China's state-owned energy companies, and we were going to be building a massive chemicals plant that was going to be bringing in 25,000 migrant workers into a town of about 30,000 people. So that could be a little disruptive. So I was there to try to make sure that the dormitories were up to international standards, again above Chinese law, and also to just do some consultation with the local community and local party officials so that everybody knew what was coming and could be prepared. So my first week there, I was sitting in a meeting where we were going through the latest estimates for the cost and the timeline for the project, all the stats. So we're sitting in this room, and it's half BP guys, half Sinopec guys, all guys, and we're running down the spreadsheet, and one of the labels hadn't yet been translated into English. There was a number 8, but the label was still in Mandarin. And my BP colleague said, what's that number? What's the 8? What's the label? And one of the Sinopec guys said, oh, that's the projected number of fatalities. And my BP colleague said, I'm sorry, what? And he said, yeah, based on a project this big, this many man-hours, we'd expect about 8 fatalities. And my colleague said, the target is not 8. The target is 0. And the Sinopec guy looked kind of befuddled, and he said, well, that's not realistic. And at first I was horrified, but then I realized he's right. Based on their track record, you'd expect about 8 fatalities. So that's what I was stepping into. And then the challenge was, well, how do I get them to believe that it could be 0 and actually invest to make that happen? Right? So I went in there going, okay, we're going to protect the human rights of workers and communities. And that was like, what? I mean, I didn't get thrown out or anything, but it was just, people were looking at me like, what? Like, you work, we're at a chemicals company. Why are you talking about human rights? What are you talking about? And then I tried, okay, these are the standards that BP uses around the world, so we're going to use them here. And you can imagine that was just arrogant. Right? So I finally had to shut up for a while and just listen to what resonated with people, what motivated them there, what did drive them, what did they think about every day. And so finally I came back and said, okay, I understand that you guys want this to be a world-class model project and this to be a world-class company. So if that is the case, these are the standards for dormitories for working conditions that world-class model projects use. And they were like, oh, okay, why didn't you say so? Right? But I think it really is about when you're trying to make the case like this, what does resonate with people? Because it's going to be different for every person.
But there was still a lot of stuff that they pushed back over to BP in terms of footing the bill on, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, totally. So like I was writing the standards for the dormitories, and I put in that there should be fire alarms and there should be smoke detectors. And the way this would work is I would get a draft, I'd send it to the translators, they'd send it to the Sinopec team, and then a couple days later they'd send it back to the translators and I'd get it back. And every time smoke detectors was crossed out and they wrote fire alarms. So it said, there will be fire alarms and there will be fire alarms. So I kept having to cross it out and write smoke detectors and send it back. And this happened like 3 or 4 times. And I was demonstrating that, right, what people say about insanity, like doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So we finally got in the meeting. And when we got to that point, I was like, these should be smoke detectors. And there's some huddling. And they were like, no, that's a translation error. They should be fire alarms. And I was like, no, they're 2 different things. And we need to have both. And they were like, oh, well, that's above Chinese law. I was like, yes, but smoke detectors save X many more lives in case of a fire. And they were like, but that's not our problem. That's the construction company's problem. Because the way that these projects work is they put out a bid, it's a flat fee, and then they kind of leave the company alone to get it done. And again, I had to sort of finally make this case of, I tried, well, if this many people die because we don't have smoke detectors, that's horrible. And they were like, but that's not our problem.
and so how did you make that?
Yeah, so finally in that particular case, they said, well, okay, if you want to do that, then BP has to pay for it.
Yeah.
Right? Which is not the point in a 50-50 joint venture, but again, you have to pick your battle. So that's what happened there.
Well, didn't they also say to you, well, this isn't sort of like, this is not going to be covered in the media? I mean, in the U.S., right, the expectation would be that if a company chooses not to install smoke detectors, you're going to get outed on the cover of the Times. People are going to be tweeting about it. It's going to be all over every other form of social media. But right, some of these places like China, that's they can actually control what the media writes about them.
Yeah, so that came out because one of the BP health and safety managers was bringing his Chinese counterpart to a BP health and safety training in the UK, and they were just going over the agenda, and there was a session there on media training. And so the Sinopec manager said, why is there a session on media training? And the BP guy said, well, when there's a bad accident, often the health and safety manager is the one to explain to the media what happened. And the Sinopec guy again looked kind of perplexed, and he said, but we wouldn't let the media know what happened.
So, it's interesting that part of your work was sort of to take these international, but what also feels like largely U.S.-based health and safety standards and apply them in different jurisdictions, whether it's this Chinese dormitory or whatnot. And I think we had also gone over one of the stories about one of the consultants who visited, I think it was Gap factories in India.
In India?
Yeah.
Yep.
Had observed the standards at the international factories and then the drastically different and much worse standards at domestic factories.
Yep.
So, I mean, it feels a little bit like multinational US-based corporations are playing a leading role in changing some of these conditions, right? And
Yep.
it directly impacts people's lives,
Yep.
oftentimes where they live, their working conditions, how much they're being paid. Um, is that the right place for that role to be, or should it really be with the local government?
It should be with the local government. It should be with national governments, which should be enforcing their own laws as well as the international treaties that they've signed up to. But sadly, that's often not the case, right? So the question is, who picks up the slack? And we need to be working at all of these different levels, right? So after the horrible Rana Plaza factory collapse in Bangladesh, right, where over 1,100 garment workers died because this building collapsed, it was pretty clear that the Bangladeshi government was not enforcing their own laws, right? I saw some statistic that like 10% of Bangladeshi parliamentarians actually own garment factories, right? So they didn't want to regulate themselves. So it's pretty clear that governments have a responsibility, and since then you've seen a lot of different parties putting pressure on the Bangladeshi government to raise the minimum wage. And that pressure has, of course, come from workers, but it's also come from other companies and other governments, right? Raise your wages. But then we also, in lieu of that, because lawmaking can take a long time to implement, we're seeing the Western brands step up, and some of them, clearly had not done enough to prevent a disaster like that. But Western brands are often the ones that are going to hold suppliers accountable, right? I mean, there's also some statistic about how few labor inspectors there are in the whole country. And so, a clothing company can often have its own team of inspectors that are going to go into factories far more often than any government inspectors. So, yes, governments need to step up, but everybody has a role to play, and nobody can be left off the hook.
Is it feasible to have internationally applicable standards?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of international standards out there, and I think part of the big question mark is, well, there are global standards, but there's no form of global governance, right? There's nobody to enforce those standards. So even at the UN, which is supposed to be the place that holds these international standards, they are only enforced when each individual government sort of takes the treaty or whatever it is and signs it and ratifies it and then decides to implement it, in their own domestic laws and enforce it however they see fit. The challenge with that is then you have global companies that are trying to figure out, how do we operate globally, and we move people and stuff and money across borders. But the governance system doesn't match that. So that's why we're seeing, people get hurt and communities fall through the cracks, because the international standards that governments are supposed to be upholding aren't being enforced. And in some cases, companies are trying to pick up the slack, but that's not really their responsibility. But again, that's because for whatever reason, either they feel like their customers want it, or it's in their best interests from a business perspective to uphold international standards. Sometimes companies are held picking up that slack.
Yeah, I think it's also really interesting because the implementation can be really different, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, right?
Totally.
I think it's actually one of the things that you talk about in the book, but also just things that we take as sort of being standard baseline here just may not be the same standard that's applicable in India or China. I think the example you talk about in the book is hot water in China. For us, that's sort of like a basic fundamental. I think about when we visit our family in India, like central heating is not a standard. It's just not a standard, right? People don't have it in the north, even though it gets pretty chilly there during the winters.
Right.
But so it varies greatly, and I think you sort of have to risk adjust and adjust your lens as you go through that.
You do. One point that I want to make, though, because this topic often comes up, and it can go to a very dangerous place, which is this whole 3 cheers for sweatshops thing, or I guess Christoph wrote a column that was like 2 cheers for sweatshops. And there is this argument that low-wage factory jobs are the best route out of poverty for a lot of people, right? And that is true. But I think, unfortunately, what's gotten lost in the rhetoric of that debate is the difference between a minimum wage factory job that is safe, that is legal. There's a difference between that and a sweatshop, right, where people are beaten and can't stand up for their 12-hour shift and are going to die because the building is going to fall down. That is never acceptable, right? And so I get very uncomfortable because this conversation often moves into this sort of cultural relativist debate of saying, oh, but that's how people live over there. That's okay. It's never okay, right? These international standards exist because there must be a floor for human respect and dignity that nobody can dip beneath, right? So that's the only thing I just want to keep in mind, that yes, implementation can be different in different places, but there's a floor.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I think that makes a lot of sense. It sounds like you're sort of drawing the line at maybe fundamental human rights that really shouldn't differ regardless of where you are.
Yeah.
So maybe to move the conversation back to tech companies specifically for a minute. I'm just wondering, one of the things that so before I came to AppNexus, I worked at a law firm, and I worked with a number of startups, some who were really early stage, like 2 people with an idea, forming a company and getting seed funding.
Yeah.
How do you make those folks understand why this should be a priority?
Yeah.
And how do they make it a priority even? I mean, they're literally trying to get a
Right,
business
2 people,
up and running.
right? Yeah, I just went to a meeting that Yahoo convened last week for startups on exactly this, on human rights. So they were saying, basically the principle was, clearly you will inevitably face challenges to free expression and privacy, and here's what you need to know, and what are you going to do about it? So they had, for an example, an investor speaking about why this was really important for his perspective, that the companies that he invests in understand privacy and free expression and what risks are they putting in place. And they had the startups, what risk mitigation measures are they putting in place? They had the startups do their pitches, but then had a panel of experts in privacy and free expression and data security just ask them questions of things like, what sort of data are you collecting? How are you encrypting it? How are you storing it? What are you going to do when you get a government request, right? And for people that are, creating sites for user-generated content, it's like, what are you going to do when somebody uploads the first course on how to kill a puppy, which is like the most benign thing that we could talk about, but you want to have a policy in place for what are you going to do about child pornography before somebody uploads the first image, not after, so that you're running around scrambling trying to figure out what to do while this image is on your site, right? So I think when we start to get into that conversation, the eyes open wide and people get that this is a risk to their business. And their community is going to shut down, their business is going to fail as soon as something like that happens if they don't have measures in place. So yeah, it might be 2 guys in a garage, but every company has to do due diligence in some form, right, to show that they've understood the market, that they've understood the risks, and this is a really important part of that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think just from an operational perspective, right, that really shapes it's an opportunity at the outset to shape how the company is going to grow, and if you just sort of let it go rampant from the outset, how do you draw that back later on?
Exactly.
What was the response from these startups?
Yeah, it was good. I mean, they were asking some of these questions of, well, I'm a guy trying to write code. Like, how do I even, start to figure this stuff out? And part of the punchline is that, there's a community of people who are thinking about these issues, and the folks from other companies that were there, places like the Berkman Center at Harvard, do actually focus on these issues and have resources, and they're people that you can call up anytime. So I guess part of the punchline is don't feel like you need to figure it out on your own. The Berkman Center is soon going to publish a resource guide for startups and human rights on how to do this sort of due diligence. So that's the kind of resource that can be really helpful. So that was part of the punchline, is like, know this is an issue, and just ask for help on how to figure it out. I mean, in the tech space, one other thing that's really interesting is that, as I have seen in other industries, human rights, free expression, and privacy is one area where companies will actually collaborate. So after the Yahoo case that I mentioned, after Google's whole kerfuffle in China of having to censor search results if they were going to locate servers there, those companies, along with Microsoft, actually got together with Human Rights Watch, Human Rights First, Amnesty International, academics like the folks at the Berkman Center, some socially responsible investors to come up with a code of conduct for the companies to say, we're facing these challenges, we honestly don't know what to do. Help us come up with some of the rules of the road. And I was part of those initiatives, and the main thing that came out of it was something called the Global Network Initiative, which is just globalnetworkinitiative.org. It's a set of principles for free expression and privacy. And the content, I think, is really good, and any company can pick them up and use them. But what was so interesting was to see all those companies get in a room together to try to sort the stuff out, right? Because we've seen that sort of multi-stakeholder collaboration in oil and gas, right? And in apparel, there's something called the Fair Labor Association, right? And again, that's different groups coming together. But for tech companies, it was like a whole new thing. So for the companies to get in the room together was a really big deal, and there was definitely a lot of mistrust at first. But I think over time there's been a recognition that these issues are not competitive, and that there's actually a lot of strength in banding together. So particularly, what we've seen in the NSA, the companies are coming out with relatively unified positions of getting together and saying, listen, government, you need to let us be more transparent in how many requests for user information we're getting, so that the public, our users, know what's going on, because they think that we're just turning things over willy-nilly. So that's been really interesting, too, to see the extent of collaboration, which I think is unusual for this industry.
Yeah, I mean, the only other example of that really comes to mind is probably on the immigration front, when they've come together and really joined forces there. But obviously very different from something that's core to your technology, like privacy or networking.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned that the series of conversations that you've been participating in was sponsored by Yahoo. And I know that we talked about the fact that intentionality doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But again, why are they doing that?
Yeah. I mean, you'd have to ask them. I don't really want to put words in their mouth, but I'll hypothesize a little bit, which is that I think it helps every company, if as many players in the ecosystem as possible understand these issues, right? In part because some of these startups are going to grow up and be partners with other big companies someday, or their employees are going to be parts of other companies that last and are around for a while. And I think that product developers need to understand these issues. It's not just the domain of lawyers or policy people, right? Again, the whole point is that this needs to be embedded in how tech companies do their business. And I think if one company messes up and allows some illegal content on their site, or if there's a big data breach, that doesn't just affect one company. I mean, I'm pretty sure, I am not a technology person, but when there's a data breach, I don't think that just affects one company.
I think you're right on that. Yeah, no, actually, so this is another one of the reasons, I guess, that your book resonated with me, because AppNexus has really always taken a leadership position on issues that affect the advertising ecosystem,
right.
In terms of helping to combat, serving ads to piracy sites,
Yep.
or helping to eliminate invalid traffic from our platform, whether that's bots clicking on ads,
Yep.
or again, these sort of illegitimate sites that
Yep.
advertisers don't really want their ads showing up on. And one of our techniques is to give our clients tools to help sort of increase the quality of the traffic that we're seeing on our site.
Yeah.
And I think in part it's because it fits with our company's mission and value, but in part it's also because it impacts the overall ecosystem, it mitigates risk, there's operational elements there too. So it's really sort of a lot of the pieces of the CSR that you had talked about.
And are there any collaborative groups? Like you say, you have these tools and you give them to clients, and are there like meetings in the industry where people get together to discuss them? Because
Yeah, they're
that's kind
definitely,
of-
well,
yeah.
they're industry groups, certainly, like, one of the two that come to mind are one, the IAB, and then the NAI. So industry groups where different players in the ecosystem have gotten together to create standards that help to police the overall ecosystem.
Yep, it's a good example.
Yeah. I think maybe we'll open it up for questions if we have any.
Yeah, great.
So we just have a microphone right over there. House right, stage left. Feel free to step on up. Oh yeah, it's on.
Hello. Okay. Hi. I work for AppNexus, and it's people who work at technology companies often want to know how things work. So, my question is, especially given that a lot of times when companies, when talking about bad things or disasters, often painted as a part of, a rebel or a black sheep within the company. It's not part of the company. I'm wondering how CSR units are successful. Is it something like process? Every project has to be approved, or it's embedded in culture? I'm just curious how, how it actually works.
Yeah. So let me make sure I understand. Is it what makes for a successful, if corporate responsibility is really embedded, what does that look like?
Right. Yeah. So you mentioned your friends, the anecdote about someone being infuriated when they did a good job but weren't recognized. Like, so it's really encouraging to hear that some CSR units believe they're successful. So I'm wondering behind the scenes what that looks like.
Yeah, sure. Again, it's highly dependent on the industry and on the company and on its context. But the punchline is really that whatever it is, it needs to be embedded in the core business. So people forward me job listings all the time in CSR because I know a lot of people and I pass them along. And I got one for a CSR manager at a big financial services firm. And I thought, fantastic, they're getting people in to analyze the risk of their investments so that they don't bring down the global economy again. And it was somebody like to manage their volunteer programs, which is awesome, but that's not what I'm so interested in. I think for a while, I don't know if this is still the case, but I think at the Gap, maybe, their social responsibility department is their supply chain department, right? Which is exactly what it should be, because that's where their biggest risks are to people. So I think it depends. I mean, the punchline is that, yes, it should be embedded. It shouldn't be sort of a department that sits in isolation and is called in after crises to help mop things up and help smooth over relations. So whether that is, what training do people get when they join the company? Lots of companies have a code of conduct that people have to sign and certify every year that maybe go through a bit of training. Are the social risks, or however you want to frame them, are those embedded in the code of conduct? How are people promoted? How are people paid? What are their bonuses based on? So it's really about embedding it into, how does the company do business? So when a company launches a new product in a new market, there are all these different gates that a project has to go through. At what point are you assessing, okay, what are the risks to people or the environment, or again, whatever is most compelling to your company? So I think success very much looks like, again, whatever you want to call it, embedded into core processes in the company. Thanks.
Hi.
Hi.
I was going to ask, what companies do you think are doing a good job of this right now, and what motivates them? I know Google makes a big deal about corporate social responsibility, and I read a book a while ago that was sort of about this idea that sometimes what motivates companies to do this is partially to be more attractive to prospective employees and sort of come across as like a really caring company.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what companies you think are doing a good job and what the motivations are.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. I get this question a lot, and it's really hard to answer. I mean, show me a company that looks angelic, and I'll show you a really good PR department, right? So the companies that I point to that are doing really good, serious work in this area are doing it because they have the biggest, most complicated risks to people. And again, stuff can still go wrong. So again, I know I keep mentioning Yahoo, but they're a company that I know well in this space. Again, they put this program in place where they convene meetings for the ecosystem. They do human rights impact assessments before they launch a new product in a new market. They're very transparent about all that. There's a whole site, section of their website where they talk about that. But they have to, because they get government requests for user information that they still have to comply with at the end of the day. So then the question is, and what the Global Network Initiative spells out, is when you get a government request, how are you going to comply with it as narrowly as possible, verify that it's from a real government agency and a real person in keeping with a real law, which is actually harder than it sounds. There's one country, I can't remember it, it might be Thailand, I'm not sure, but I think the police actually use a free email service for their work email. So somebody at a company can get a request for user information from general dot whatever at yahoo.com. And so the company's, if you get, there could be a new employee who is totally freaked out and was like, oh, I guess this is, but you've got to spell out some of these processes in place. So they're one. Coca-Cola has a really good team in place that is trying to make sure that their suppliers comply with international labor standards. And I know the folks on the team, they're doing amazing work, but they have to put that in place because they've had union organizers shot on the floor of their bottling plants. And again, that can still happen, right? The companies don't control the outcomes. So I think, again, if we're talking about the real CSR and corporate responsibility stuff, it's hard to give a gold star to anybody because the issues that we're working on, again, they're not in one party's control. So I think that employees really do want their companies to be doing good in the world. And I guess we didn't sort of share the punchline of my book, not to ruin it because I want you all to, read it and enjoy it. But one of the themes that emerged that was really the kicker for me, that helped me reconcile my time at BP and these sort of conflicting BPs that I saw and that I felt, it was recognizing that this work is incremental. And that again, if we're working on these really tricky, complex, thorny issues, it's going to take a while and we're going to have these big steps backward. But one of the things that was so inspiring about interviewing the 36 other people that I interviewed was that they kind of got that and embraced it and had faith that these steps that might look really small to people outside the company, like launching a new policy or signing up to one of these voluntary initiatives, like inside we know that that takes a lot of work, right? It takes a lot of alignment and a lot of behind the scenes work to make a company sign up to that. So there was just a lot of optimism among the people that I spoke with that these steps are moving in the right direction. So for me, it was recognizing that, no, I did not manage to transform the whole of BP, tragically, but I know that my work really did make a difference to those 127 families that we had to relocate for that project in Indonesia, for those tens of thousands of migrant workers around that project in China and the people that live nearby. And, that's not bad. It's not good enough, and it's not big enough, and it's not fast enough, and it's not systemic enough, but it's not bad. So again, I don't think there's a great answer to your question. I think that companies that are really doing good work are the ones that are thinking about how do we put processes in place whether or not we talk about it.
Hi, Christine. I work here at AppNexus, but I also am part of Startup Weekend New York.
Right on.
We talked, there was discussion today a lot about making a business case, whether it's with risk mitigation, good PR, revenue, bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
What advice do you have for startups who are entering the social good space or social impact space, or people who work on projects who are focused on the human rights cases, when is a good time to bring up human rights, if at all, or is it better to keep the conversations at the business case level of this is why we need to be caring about the 8
Yeah.
lives on this project?
I mean, I think that it goes back to the point that I made about really listening to people. I mean, again, a lot of these startups are in it because they think that they are promoting human rights, right? And they're trying to make people's lives better. And I know you hear that all the time, right, with the startups that you interact with. Like, they are so excited about something because they think it's going to make people's lives better. And that may well be true, but they have to understand that there are risks to this, right? I mean, a lot of the big companies that we've talked about that have gotten in trouble are all about, free expression and access to information and allowing people to connect. And that's all amazing, but I think we've seen that there are risks to that. So some of the questions that kept coming up in these conversations that I've been having with startups, again, they allow people to organize so that they can go, like, have a picnic or something, and that's awesome. But what if they're organizing to protest the government? Like, the government's going to be really psyched that you're collecting all this information that is stored on servers in their jurisdiction because they have every right to subpoena those. Right? So, I mean, please, bring it up early and often. Otherwise, they can't fulfill the mission that they set out to achieve. They're going to undermine their own intent.
So I'm going to be the last question.
Yep.
We have 5 minutes left. Okay. So hi, my name is Stella. I just recently graduated and I majored in international relations, and this kind of corporate responsibility and international is a huge interest of mine.
Right.
And I wanted to ask you a question that's sort of not related to human rights, but sort of related to social responsibility and sort of the corporate idealist image. I would obviously have to read the book. It's about sort of income distribution and sort of giving back to the society, because especially in this globalized society, and especially with companies like oil companies, specifically the oil industry, it's being a problem that a couple foreign companies are owning the reserves or the production facilities of certain countries that have oil, and the income from the oil money is not being distributed very well.
Yeah.
And I think personally that that's part of the social responsibility of the corporations that do have the access to resources and do have the access to the facilities, to production as well. And I know it's not really related to human rights, and you said that some companies use human rights as a PR activity, especially after a disaster happens. So as your work seems like you've been helping a lot of workers on the ground of these corporations, we've been working on the working conditions within the company and things like that, and helping the companies to look better and to understand the value of human rights within the working conditions and things like that. But if that's sort of a move on the PR activities for the corporations to keep their money flowing, because it is their business.
Yeah.
What
No,
is
I got
the
you.
impact?
What's the systemic?
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I got it. No, I got it. It's a good. You're exactly right. It's the right question. Okay, so first of all, let me just make clear that the work that I was doing with local communities, particularly in Indonesia, this was not PR work. There were no cameras within thousands of miles of this project. But I think I heard what you're saying, which is you're pointing to the difference between local micro activities, which might be all great and good and helping some people, but there are systemic issues at play, right? So the issue of revenue distribution is something that is handled at a national level, right? And so there's something that has to take place in that countries, this is a slip that happens all the time, which is actually quite telling, I think, that countries need to put in place equitable laws, because when they don't, companies get caught in the middle. So where I was working in Indonesia had just passed a new law to get at exactly what you asked about, which is revenue distribution. So in West Papua, as well as in Aceh, the Indonesian government had just passed a law which said that a higher proportion of the revenues from natural resources projects in those provinces should go back to the provinces. Right? Exactly as you say, they should be going back to the communities who will have to live by the stuff getting yanked out of the ground, right? Now, the problem, of course, is that in Indonesia, corruption is endemic. And even though they passed this law, as in any country, it would take a long time for the regulations to get written and implemented. In the meantime, though, of course, BP is there on the ground, faced with a lot of fear and a lot of concern, because people knew what had happened in other parts of the country, right? Of this sentiment of you're yanking our stuff out of the ground and we're not seeing any benefits from it. So then what does the company do? Okay, well, one thing you said, we can give back. But I have to say, this is also just another one of my pet peeves, like the whole like giving back thing, because it kind of implies that you were taking inappropriately in the first place. And like, what's that all about, right? Like, why are you taking? So I don't like the whole sort of giving back mentality. It's sort of carbon offset of like, okay, we're going to do harm somewhere, but then we'll make up for it somewhere else, right? And that's no good. So it couldn't have been making up for it with philanthropy, but we also, the company can't be in the position of trying to tell the government how to spend its money, because that doesn't look so good either. What we did end up doing there, which I think is a good model, is working with the World Bank, because they're exactly the kind of body that does have the authority, sort of the moral authority, to come in, work with a government, not have another agenda, right? But to be trying to work with the government to do that kind of capacity building so that they could spend its revenues better and that the money could trickle back and that the company's not in a position of trying to act like a government.